If you criticize capitalism long enough, eventually at some point, you're going to hear, so what, are you a Marxist? But what if the options aren't simply corporate oligarchy or an authoritarian state? And what if both those systems fail for a more fundamental reason? This is the Silent Republic. I reject capitalism because I believe that by its very nature, it is exploitative. When the organizing principle of society becomes the accumulation of wealth, you get, well, this. A world where wealth filters upwards to a small and elite class of billionaires and corporate monopolies. A world where the planet is ravaged for short-term profits without regard for future generations or sustainability. A world where corporations are incentivized to extract as much value from human beings as possible. Housing becomes an investment rather than their homes, and healthcare becomes nothing but a system of exploitation, and food and medicine and survival itself becomes conditional. A world where the ultra wealthy buy our politicians and our political system remains captured by the ever revolving door of corporate interests. This right here, this is what you get, and the system is not tenable. And I know what a lot of people are going to say to this, and that's some version of, well, you don't understand capitalism. It can be managed, it can be restricted, and sure, a new deal can happen, or we could reach some sort of like something like the Nordic states have, right? That's possible. But I think at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, capitalism trends towards oligarchy, and it will always sacrifice democracy on the altar of capital gains. Listen, I've read Marx extensively, and if I'm honest, I agree with probably 75% of what he says, and I think he's absolutely correct in his diagnosis of what capitalism is and what it leads to. And that's that capitalism leads to exploitation and alienation and wealth concentration and the tendency for wealth and capital to consolidate into power, and political power at that. But where I have to break with Marx is in his prescription, because I have the benefit of hindsight. So I'm not saying that I have like some insight that Marx didn't have, but I can look back at the 20th century and see how these things actually played out. Because nearly every revolution begins in the name of justice, but then quickly becomes subsumed by a new ruling class, a new elite that insists they are justice. And it's like a prophecy that humanity cannot seem to outrun. Marx envisioned a system where the wealth and capital of the bourgeoisie would be seized and then redistributed by the state. And then after this class conflict came to an end, the state would sort of naturally wither and go away. But that's not what happened, because Marx correctly identified the exploitation built within capitalism. But I don't think that he saw the deeper and more fundamental issue that both Marxism and capitalism would lead to, and that is the very human tendency to consolidate power. We are a species evolved in scarcity, and for most of human history, we existed in small tribal bands where we competed with one another for limited resources. And because of that, we are deeply shaped by like two fundamental drives, and that is fear of scarcity, and that is fear of the other. And what Marx didn't fully account for is that the ruling class, whether that be the bourgeoisie of capitalism or state officials, they quickly view those beneath as the other. And we are still very much driven by this fear of scarcity, of not having, of lack itself. Because resources aren't simply hoarded under capitalism alone, they are hoarded within any system where power becomes centralized. And so I think that the bourgeoisie and the capitalist system and the Stalinist problem of Soviet communism are essentially the same underlying issue, and that is the consolidation of power itself. Because when systems collapse, opportunists rush in to fill the vacuum. And many revolutions begin with with noble aspirations and for noble causes. But what we don't recognize is that the seeds for the corruption of any revolution already exist from the outset within the heart of every single person. Those same instincts that helped us survive for hundreds of thousands of years now threaten to drive civilization towards self-destruction. And look, I'm not a centrist. I'm not both sidesing this. But I think foundationally, every system should be examined against a foundational principle, and that's whether it protects human dignity. And because of that, power must be dispersed. And so this is why I am as skeptical of large states as I am of captured markets or corporate monopolies. Because the pattern throughout history is painfully clear. Wherever power consolidates, catastrophe soon follows behind. And so this is why transparency must be engineered into every system, into every institution. Power should always be interrogated, and we should always challenge the systems that uphold it and never hold power sacred. And we must protect dissent, the right to criticize, to disagree, to speak freely. Because free speech is not just a political principle. It is a safeguard against dehumanization. And yes, that includes speech that we hate, speech that we disagree with, and speech that we even find despicable. Because at the end of the day, when a society becomes comfortable with silencing people, history shows us again and again where this always leads. It ends in suppression. And so that's why, whether we're talking about corporate oligarchies or authoritarian communist states, the central issue remains the same. When there is a permanent ruling class, democracy quickly dissolves, and then human rights go with it. And this happens when power crystallizes around leaders who cannot be removed. And so this is why leadership should be stewardship, not celebrity, and not wealth accumulation, not permanent either. And leadership should cost something. And when I say cost something, I mean that leadership should cost to lead, because if it doesn't cost, you're not leading correctly. If it's about self-aggrandizing or about wealth accumulation, then you've missed the mark, and it's not leadership at all. We live in a civilization where people starve while so much food is wasted and thrown away, where people die from completely preventable medical issues, where millions cannot afford housing, even though there are empty homes everywhere. And most of the suffering is not inevitable. It is artificial scarcity to maintain a profit. I believe that material dignity should be guaranteed in housing and food and medical care. And these shouldn't be withheld because of people's societal utility. And why? Because we're no longer small tribal bands fighting over scraps. We are a global civilization, and we can do better than this bullshit. We built systems capable of abundance, and so the problem isn't scarcity anymore. The problem is distribution, and the problem is the concentration of wealth and resources in the hands of a few. Now, I call this ethical radicalism because I am just as radical as any Marxist, but I believe that revolutions always devolve into chaos. And so we must center ethics within any revolution. That must be the central pillar to keep us grounded. Now, some people will call this unrealistic. They'll say, how is this possible? How can such a system be built? And the truth is, I don't think it can, at least not in my lifetime, but maybe my daughter's. Because there's a path and there are ways, and there will be stepping stones to reach this vision of the world. And along the way, capital gains and state power alike will try to drag us back to our worst drives and our worst human inclinations and the very worst of what humanity can be. But we have to fight for a future that I believe is actually possible. Fight for what we can become. Workers of the world unite. This is what Marx envisioned, and I agree. But I don't think that power should be handed over to a very powerful state. I envision decentralized worker cooperatives centered around democratic worker control, where the means of production are owned by the workers themselves. So not managed by the state, not held by the state, but held by the workers. Listen, unions are a decent start. Like, they work historically, but I would advocate for working towards a gilded system, one where quality is maintained through competition and through innovation, and the gains of society are shared by all, and by all, I mean everyone in society. Public healthcare is a must, and there isn't a future where there isn't a healthcare system for all people. A world where there aren't insurance CEOs who try to maximize profits by denying you care in the hopes that you die before you can appeal. That's fucking gross. We simply must unhitch profit from people's healthcare. Elections should be publicly funded. And listen, I know that there's people who say that that is a restriction on free speech, but Citizens United, like, come on. Corporations, they're not individuals, and they don't have the right, or at least they shouldn't have the right, to pour countless dollars into super PACs that fund political campaigns where bribery and corruption is rife. Like, that shouldn't happen. And that's not just me saying that. That's the majority view of, like, most Americans, right or left. Candidates should have to run on actual policies and not funded by billionaires. And I mean that for both sides. But campaigns that are funded by the public and must appeal to the public. Bottom line is, the system that we currently have incentivizes corruption. So bribery, both legal and illegal, is just baked into the system at this point. I believe that monopoly should be broken and labor protections strictly enforced. And we should focus more on local and community-owned models, where what a community produces is owned by and used by that local community. Markets small enough to matter to the individual. Markets where locals are supported and the community owns it, and not massive international conglomerates. So is this socialism? Am I a socialist? Is this what I'm advocating for? Well, I think many socialists would deny me the right to be called such. I call myself a libertarian socialist, but oftentimes my views anger the left nearly as much, though not quite as much, as the right. But to the Marxists, I say this: a revolution that cannot survive dissent deserves to die. And to the capitalists, I say this: you are participating in a system that feeds into the very worst drives humanity has, and you sacrifice human dignity for wealth. I'm not interested in replacing one ruling class with another. I'm interested in building systems that keep power accountable. Because the question for me isn't capitalism or Marxism. The question is, how do we build systems that protect human dignity without creating new tyrants? I'm a revolutionary, and I believe that the revolution of this century must be human-centered and not merely ideological. The future shouldn't just be seized, it should be built and stewarded. And so this revolution I hope for is not merely the transfer of power, it is the redistribution of responsibility. Let the next revolution be the one that feeds the hungry and heals the earth and leaves no victim or tyrant in its wake. This is the Silent Republic.